It is late afternoon. You stand in the driveway with the car engine still running. You check the rearview mirror, unbuckle the seatbelt, and stare at the garage door. There is a heavy, dull weight settling at the base of your throat. Not sharp, just there. You notice the profound quiet of the empty vehicle before the next thought arrives, but you do not name it. You just turn the key, step out, and walk inside. Look at a forest, and the eyes are immediately drawn to the extremes. We see the towering, old-growth canopy hoarding the sunlight, casting massive shadows and demanding the lion's share of the water. Below them, we see the bright, noisy saplings fighting for space on the floor, vibrant and loud, demanding their own resources to grow. But we are missing the engine. Beneath the topsoil, operating entirely in the dark, is a massive, silent network keeping the entire ecosystem alive. Society looks at the generational forest and just sees the boomers and the millennials. They completely ignore the subterranean network that literally holds the dirt together. Generation X, they operate entirely in the shadows, absorbing the ambient shock of the ecosystem without ever asking for a drop of water. They do not expect the sunlight to reach them. They have adapted to the dark. What the pattern points toward is a highly evolved form of drought resilience. They do not demand resources, likely since somewhere along the line, they realized the resources were not coming. If I had to name it, and I am not sure I can, it does not look like independence. It looks like a locked door. I am aware this is a heavy way to describe people who are, objectively, just standing in the grocery store aisle trying to decide on paper towels. But they buy them. They pack the car. The world keeps spinning. Consider the historical ledger. The 1980s delivered unprecedented divorce rates and a sudden dismantling of the traditional family grid. We are looking at an analog childhood raised by empty houses, house keys hanging on shoestrings, and television static. They unlocked the front door and stepped into the quiet. They built their own scaffolding since the adults were absent, forging an organism that learned to solve its own problems long before it was entirely ready. There is a concept in developmental ecology I keep returning to when looking at this specific generational trench. Studies on early environmental neglect suggest that when a young organism consistently encounters an absence of external regulation, its response is not to find a better approach. It stops signaling for help entirely. It internalizes the stabilization process, which, if you have been carrying this, might explain a specific thing. Not the behavior, but the exhaustion underneath it. This observation provides context for why asking for assistance today feels less like a choice and more like a violation of core programming. The part I keep returning to is the math. This subterranean network is currently being drained from both directions. This is the brutal, suffocating reality of the sandwich generation. They are funding the survival of the future while paying the debts of the past. They pump life-saving nutrients up to decaying old-growth trees, aging parents requiring immense financial, logistical, and medical care. Simultaneously, they funnel resources down to struggling saplings, adult children facing insurmountable economic crises and housing shortages. All of this is happening in the dark. All of this is happening without applause. It is late evening. You sit at the kitchen counter. You just paid a parent's exorbitant medical bill online, then immediately transferred rent money to a 24-year-old son. Your shoulders lock into place. The screen goes dark. A heavy quiet settles in the room. You close the laptop and wash a single coffee cup. You notice the isolating silence of the house, but you do not name it. You just dry the cup and turn off the light. And I keep wondering, what would happen if that load-bearing wall simply decided to rest for 5 minutes? What if they let the fuse stay blown? Not a dramatic collapse, just an ordinary evening where nobody steps in to clean the spill, mediate the argument, or fix the router. Look at the corporate grid. Despite comprising a mere 20% of the population, this generation holds 31% of core leadership roles. They act as the crucial translators between the rigid demands of the older board members and the fluid expectations of the younger workforce. Their historical inheritance forges them into reliable mortar. They do not flinch at instability since instability is their native habitat. It looks like sitting on a chaotic video call, muting the microphone, and staring at the wall while two generations argue over protocol. Society heavily criticizes Generation X for their signature apathy, their dark humor, their apparent detachment. They are called cynical. They are accused of not caring enough about the shifting cultural winds. But the more I look at it, I do not think it is apathy at all. This brings us to the part that I have thought about how to say. I still do not have the version that does it exactly right, but here is the closest. Just as certain fungi absorb and neutralize heavy metals from the soil, this generation's cynicism is a highly active toxin filtration system. Having survived constant systemic instability, the Cold War, the Challenger disaster, the 2008 economic wildfire, they use emotional detachment to filter out societal panic. But we have to go one layer deeper. Why do they filter the toxins? Somewhere in that empty analog house, they decided that being the unbreakable bedrock was the single version of themselves worth keeping. The armor is not just protecting them from the noise of the world. It is protecting the story that says they are fundamentally unrescuable. Asking for help, even once, feels like betraying the exact structural integrity that kept them alive. And then it is just tomorrow. You make coffee, you commute, you add another unprecedented historical event to the ledger with a detached shrug and you go to work. It is fine. It is usually fine. The movement here is not about demanding the canopy finally look down and offer praise. In my experience, the old-growth trees rarely see the soil. The shift happens when the subterranean network establishes its own boundaries, cutting off the nutrient drain to toxic roots, recognizing that funding each crisis is not an absolute imperative. It is about honoring that defensive shield not as a defect, but as the blueprint of survival. The environment is not here anymore. You are, and part of you already knows the difference between then and now. That knowing is where movement starts. You cannot dismantle it by deciding to, but you can start asking whether it still needs to run. You will probably wake up tomorrow and continue filtering the toxins, since understanding the weight of the anvil and actually dropping it are two very different speeds. If anything here was specific enough to matter, you will know exactly what to do with it. But I keep wondering, what would it feel like, specifically, to let someone see you in the one moment you rarely let anyone see? The forest stands as long as they refuse to fall.